My name is Clara. Back in 2012, I was just out of college, broke, and looking for a way to save up for my master's degree. I was an art history major, which, as you can imagine, wasn't exactly a hot commodity on the job market. So, I found a gig as an au pair for a wealthy family in the outskirts of Boston. The family, the Wilsons, were super nice on the surface. Mr. Wilson was a tech CEO, and his wife, a retired ballerina with a perpetual smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They had 2 kids, twins, a boy named Leo and a girl named Mia, both about 5 years old, with huge, curious eyes and hair the color of corn silk. Their house was this sprawling, modern glass and steel monstrosity, all sharp lines and minimalist furniture. It felt more like a museum than a home, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in a display case. The first thing I noticed, the really weird thing, was the mirrors. They were everywhere, not just in bathrooms or bedrooms, but in the hallways, the living room, even the kitchen. And they were massive, floor-to-ceiling sheets of glass with thick, ornate frames that looked completely out of place in the sleek, modern house. But what was even more unsettling was how they were positioned. They were always facing the main areas where the kids played. There was one in the living room reflecting the entire sofa area, another in the dining room reflecting the long table, and a giant one in the playroom that showed every single corner of the room. It was like a silent, glassy eye watching everything the kids did. When I first brought it up to Mrs. Wilson, she just laughed, a sound like dry leaves rustling. "Oh, those. They're just for feng shui," she said, her smile not moving an inch. "They're meant to reflect good energy and keep the bad spirits out." I was young, I needed the money, and I just shrugged it off as a rich people eccentricity. But deep down, it felt wrong. It felt like they were trying to catch something or someone in the act. The unsettling feeling grew into a constant hum in the back of my mind. One evening, about a month into my stay, the kids were already asleep, and I was cleaning the master bathroom. It was this huge space, all marble and glass, with a monstrous mirror that covered one entire wall behind the sink. I was wiping the counter, humming some tune to myself, when I happened to glance up. In the reflection, behind me, was a figure. It was tall and thin, a shadow draped in darkness, standing completely still in the doorway. It wasn't a person, it was a blotch of nothingness, a void in the shape of a man. My heart stopped. My throat went dry. I spun around, my rag forgotten, my eyes darting to the doorway. Nothing. Just the empty, tiled hallway, bathed in the soft glow of a single nightlight. I stood there for a good minute, my heart hammering against my ribs, before I convinced myself it was just a trick of the light, a tired mind playing games. But I couldn't shake the image. It was so real, so solid, even though it wasn't there. After that night, the mirrors started to do something else. Something far more disturbing than just showing me things that weren't there. They started to show me glimpses of what could be. I was in the playroom one afternoon, watching the twins build a Lego fortress. They were laughing, chattering away, their little faces lit up with pure joy. I happened to glance at the giant mirror across the room. In the reflection, Leo and Mia weren't laughing. They were silent, their faces pale and streaked with tears, their eyes wide with a silent, abject terror I couldn't comprehend. I whipped my head back to them, and they were still there, still giggling, still piling one Lego brick on top of another. Another time, I was reading to them in the living room, and in the mirror behind me, I saw them bolt upright, their tiny legs pumping as they ran for the door, their faces twisted into masks of panic. But when I looked at them directly, they were sitting calmly on the sofa, listening to the story. These weren't fleeting glimpses. They were clear, undeniable glitches that lasted for a few seconds before the reflections snapped back to reality. It was like the mirrors were showing me a different reality, a twisted, silent version of our world where the kids were constantly living in a state of silent dread. That was when I started getting paranoid. I'd stand in the hallway and watch the kids play, my eyes glued to their reflections in the mirror, waiting for the next horrifying scene to unfold. It got so bad that I started avoiding the mirrors altogether, a task that was nearly impossible in a house designed around them. I'd walk with my head down, my gaze fixed on the floor, my peripheral vision trained to ignore the shimmering surfaces. The kids, in their innocent way, must have sensed my unease. Leo would tug on my shirt, his voice a soft question. "Clara, why are you sad?" and I'd force a smile, a brittle, fake thing, and tell him I was just a little tired. I was terrified of what the mirrors were showing me, but I was even more terrified of what they weren't. I was starting to believe that the joyful, laughing children in front of me were the lie, and the terrified, silently weeping ones in the mirrors were the truth. The atmosphere in the house shifted, becoming heavy, thick with a dread that was almost tangible. I was no longer a person in a home. I was a witness in a haunted house, trapped in a silent film of terror. One night, I was putting Mia to bed. She had a cold and was coughing, her little face flushed. I tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and turned to leave. As I walked out of her room, I glanced at the mirror on the opposite wall. It was a full-length one, framed in dark, twisted wood that looked like gnarled branches. And there, standing behind Mia's bed, was that same dark figure from the bathroom, but this time it wasn't a shadow. It was defined, a gaunt, skeletal thing with a wide, lipless grin. It had its long, bony fingers outstretched, hovering just inches from Mia's face. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My lungs refused to pull in air. I just stared, frozen in the doorway, as the creature in the mirror leaned in, its grin widening, its empty sockets fixed on me, as if it knew I was watching. I stood there, a silent observer of a scene from a nightmare. The creature, a wisp of ink and malice, turned its head slowly, a non-existent head, and looked directly at me through the mirror. Its lipless grin stretched impossibly wide, and it raised a bony, elongated hand and placed it on the mirror's surface, on the very spot where my hand was pressed to the doorframe. The glass didn't fog up, it didn't ripple. It seemed to absorb the blackness of its touch. The terror I had been holding at bay finally broke through, a hot, liquid rush of pure panic. I stumbled backward, my heart a frantic drum solo against my ribs, and slammed Mia's door shut, the click of the latch sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. I leaned my back against the wood, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps, my mind screaming at me to run, to leave, to get out of that house and never look back. The next morning, I woke up feeling hollowed out, like a skeleton of my former self. The events of the night before had left a residue of fear on everything. I got Leo and Mia ready. For their day, my movements stiff and robotic. I couldn't look them in the eye, not after seeing what their reflections were showing me. The mirrors were no longer a mere curiosity. They were a portal to a world of silent horror, a window into a reality I couldn't bear to face. I had to know what was going on. I had to understand what I was seeing. The kids, sensing my distress, were unusually quiet. They ate their cereal in silence, their eyes following me with a concerned, unervingly knowing gaze. I felt a sense of urgency, an almost physical pull toward the playroom, the largest room in the house, where the biggest, most grotesque mirror hung, taunting me with its glassy surface. That I made my way down the long, silent hallway, each step a heavy weight on the polished wood floor. The house, usually so full of the twins' joyful noise, was eerily quiet. It was like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to do something. The playroom door was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me in. I pushed it open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was bathed in the hazy morning light, but it felt cold, wrong. The toys were scattered on the floor. The Lego fortress stood half-finished, a monument to a moment of innocence that felt a million miles away. And then there was the mirror. It covered the entire back wall, a dark, imposing presence that seemed to drink the light from the room. I felt a chill run down my spine, but this time it wasn't fear. It was a strange, morbid curiosity. I needed to look. I needed to see what it was going to show me this time. I walked toward it, my reflection appearing on its surface like a ghost. I looked tired, my eyes were sunken, and my hair was a mess. As I got closer, the room behind me in the reflection seemed to distort, the lines of the walls and windows blurring and shifting. The image of the room twisted and warped, and I felt a sudden, dizzying sense of disorientation. The floor of the playroom in the reflection began to crack and splinter, revealing a black, endless void beneath. And then I saw it. A figure, dark and shimmering, was slowly rising from the depths of the floor, its head and torso emerging from the blackness. It was a creature of pure shadow, its form indistinct and wavering like smoke. But its eyes, two pinpricks of malevolent red light, were fixed on me. and its hand, a long, skeletal thing with impossibly long fingers, was reaching for something just beyond my reflection. On the other side of the glass, it was then I realized what the creature in the mirror was reaching for, the real me. And that's when I saw her, too, in the mirror. My reflection wasn't just my reflection anymore. It was me, but on the other side of the glass, eyes wide with a terror that mirrored my own. She was banging on the mirror, her knuckles white, her mouth open in a silent scream. She was trapped, and she was trying to warn me. The creature was rising from the floor behind her, its smoky form solidifying, its red eyes burning. I watched as it reached for her, its fingers closing around her throat. I saw the look of abject panic in her eyes, a look that told me she was about to be swallowed by the darkness. And I understood everything. The mirrors weren't just showing me another reality. They were a boundary, and something was trying to cross over. I screamed, a primal sound of pure horror that tore through the silence of the house. I wasn't just looking at my reflection anymore. I was looking at a living, breathing person, a person who was me, being choked to death on the other side of a pane of glass. My hands flew to my own neck, a desperate reflex, and I could feel my throat tightening, a phantom pressure squeezing the air from my lungs. The creature was pulling her back, dragging my reflection, my other self, down into the blackness of the floor. Her hands, my hands, were still pressed against the glass, her fingers leaving faint, ghostly streaks. I knew that if she went, I would go too. This wasn't a hallucination, wasn't a delusion. This was real, and I had to do something, anything, to save her, to save me. My eyes darted around the room, searching for an answer, a way out. I was an art history major. I knew a thing or two about symbolism and folklore, and I remembered something my professor had once mentioned in a class about ancient superstitions. A way to ward off evil, a way to break a connection. I saw the silver tongs from the fireplace set in the corner, a glint of metal in the dark room, and I knew what I had to do. I grabbed the tongs, the heavy metal cold against my skin, my body shaking with a mix of terror and adrenaline. I held them up, pointing them at the mirror, feeling like a warrior about to face a dragon. The me on the other side of the glass was almost gone, just her desperate, frantic fingers still visible, clawing at the surface. I took a deep breath, and with all the strength I could muster, I slammed the tongs against the mirror's surface, aiming for the center where the creature was pulling my other self down. There was a deafening crack, a sound like a thunderclap, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The glass shards rained down on the floor, tinkling like a morbid wind chime. And as the mirror broke, the scene in the reflection, the one of me being pulled into the darkness, shattered with it. It was gone, replaced by the splintered, distorted reflections of the empty playroom that I stood there, gasping for air, the tongs still clenched in my trembling hands. The room was now filled with the light and a different kind of silence, a silence of relief, of a battle won. The fear hadn't vanished, but it had receded, replaced by a profound, bone-deep weariness. I sank to the floor, my legs giving out beneath me, and sat amidst the broken shards of glass. My heart was still pounding, but the phantom pressure on my throat was gone. The house, for the first time since I'd arrived, felt truly empty. The dark hum of dread had been replaced by a quiet that felt safe. I never saw the Wilsons again after that. I called them from a hotel that night, giving them a rushed, frantic explanation about a family emergency and how I had to leave immediately. They didn't ask questions. Their silence on the other end of the line was a confirmation of my worst fears. They knew. They knew what was in their house, and they used the mirrors to protect their own kids, hoping whatever it was would find a different host to torment. I don't know what happened to that thing, if it's still out there, lurking behind shattered glass. All I know is that when I look in a mirror now, I never look for too long. I can still see the ghost of that other me, her terrified eyes, her desperate plea for help. She's not trapped anymore, but she's a part of me now, a constant reminder of the day I looked in the mirror and almost lost myself. Man, it's wild to even put this down in words, but here I am, scrolling through this sub late at night, and I just feel like I need to share what happened to me. It all went down a few years ago, back when I was a fresh-faced 22-year-old, straight out of university, and feeling pretty invincible. I'd just landed my first real job as an au pair for a family in the English countryside. The place was gorgeous, this massive Victorian manor with a stone facade covered in ivy, tucked away in a tiny little village called Blackwood. The family, the Wilsons, seemed nice enough. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson were busy professionals, always traveling, and they had 2 kids, a quiet, pale-faced little girl named Lily, who was about 6, and her older brother, Leo, who was 10 and pretty much glued to his tablet. My life back then was all about new beginnings. I was in a new country, feeling free and independent for the first time, and a bit naive, I guess. I saw this job as an adventure, a way to see the world, not some horror movie waiting to happen. The house itself had this strange, heavy silence about it, the kind that feels less like peaceful quiet and more like a held breath, like the air itself was listening. The first week was fine, just me getting into the routine. The kids were well-behaved, if a little withdrawn. It was a good gig, easy money, and I had a whole wing of the house to myself. But then I found the list. It was tucked into a drawer in my room, a single, folded piece of thick, parchment-like paper with elegant, almost spidery handwriting. It wasn't a list of chores or a schedule, it was a list of rules. And they were weird. The first one said, "Never leave the hallway dark after 11 p.m. I laughed it off. Kid stuff, right? Maybe they're afraid of the dark. Then there was another one. Do not open the curtains in the east-facing study after midnight. That one was a bit more specific, a bit more unnerving. But the one that really got me was near the bottom. If you hear someone calling your name from upstairs, do not answer. Do not go upstairs. Do not acknowledge it. My name, specifically. It felt like a direct, personal warning. I thought it was some kind of elaborate prank or a cultural superstition I wasn't aware of, so I just folded it up and put it back in the drawer, already deciding I wasn't going to let a piece of paper dictate how I lived my life. Big mistake. That first night, the rules were the furthest thing from my mind. I was just tired after a long day of playing hide and seek and trying to get Leo to do his homework. I finished my book a little after 11 p.m. and decided to call it a night. On my way to the bedroom, I just forgot. I left the long, dark hallway that led to my room completely black. No lights on, nothing. I didn't even think about it until I was already in bed, half asleep. I was just about to drift off when a sound jolted me awake. It was a soft, rhythmic scraping, like fingernails dragging across a wooden floor, coming from the far end of the hallway, right outside the kids' rooms. My heart started thumping against my ribs. It wasn't a loud noise, but in that absolute, heavy silence, it was deafening. I lay there for what felt like an eternity, listening to it move, inch by painful inch, closer to my door. It sounded like something was trying to get to me, or at least, trying to get down the hall. I finally mustered up the courage to throw on my slippers and peek my head out the door. The hallway was still pitch black, but I could just make out a figure at the end of the hall, a long, thin shadow clinging to the wall, not moving, just standing there. It wasn't human-shaped, not exactly. It was too tall, too slender, and I couldn't make out any features. The silence was back, even heavier than before. The scraping had stopped. I slammed my door shut and locked it, my hands shaking, and didn't sleep a wink for the rest of the night. The next morning, everything was back to normal. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and the house felt light again. The kids came down for breakfast, acting like nothing had happened. I was shaken, but I told myself it was just my imagination running wild in a new, spooky house. Maybe it was a draft, or an old pipe, or some kind of natural creakiness. I decided to test it that night, just to prove to myself I wasn't going crazy. I intentionally left the hallway light on. Nothing happened. The house was completely silent, the kind of peaceful quiet you'd expect in a place so far from the city. I tried the same thing the next night, and the next, and the next. Every single time I left the light on, the house was just a house. A big, old, quiet house. But the first night I got lazy and left the light off again, the same thing happened. The scraping, the shadow at the end of the hall. It was like clockwork, a terrible, supernatural timer. I realized then that the rules weren't just weird suggestions. They were a set of instructions for survival, a fragile peace treaty with whatever was lurking in the shadows of that house. And I had just broken the first rule, opening the door to a part of the house I didn't even know existed. A place where the lights needed to stay on. A place where something was waiting for the dark. From that night on, a new, unsettling routine began. I would follow the rules obsessively. The hallway light stayed on, the study curtains remained closed, and I made sure to lock my door every single night. The house, in return, was quiet. Deceptively so. The silence was heavier now, charged with a knowing energy, like something was just waiting for me to slip up. But the final, most terrifying rule was the hardest one to keep. If you hear someone calling your name from upstairs, do not answer. It became a twisted game of cat and mouse. At first, it was subtle, just a whisper on the wind, a faint echo that sounded a little bit like my name, maybe a figment of my tired imagination. I'd ignore it, and it would fade. But then it started to get more insistent, more clear. And the voice, it was mine. A perfect, uncanny imitation of my voice, as if I were standing in the attic, calling to myself. It would start with a soft, melodic, "Clara," and then grow louder, more desperate. "Clara, please, can you come help me?" I would sit on the stairs, frozen, my hands gripping the banister until my knuckles turned white, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. It was so hard not to answer, to not go to the source of the sound. It was my voice, my name, my plea. It felt like a part of me was trapped up there, begging for help. The worst part was that the voice wasn't just an echo. It was smart. It was learning. One night, after a terrible day where I'd had a long, tearful phone call with my sister about something that happened when we were kids, I heard it. "Clara, please, I'm so sorry about the broken doll. I know it was my fault." My voice called from upstairs, a sound I hadn't thought about in 20 years. A secret only my sister and I knew. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just mimicking me. It knew things about me, things I hadn't told anyone. It felt like it was crawling inside my head, picking through my memories, looking for the perfect emotional bait to lure me up there. It was more than a haunting. It was a personal violation, a psychological terror that felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. The next night was the worst. The kids were asleep, the house was silent, and I was trying to read in my room when I heard it. My voice. But this time it wasn't pleading. It was weeping. A gut-wrenching, heartbroken sound that made my entire body ache with empathy. "Clara, please, I'm so lonely. I miss my mom. I wish she would come back." It was the exact phrase I had whispered to myself on the night my mother left us when I was a teenager. A sentence I had never spoken aloud to another human being. A shard of my soul, a piece of me I had buried deep inside. I snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. The fear and the manipulation were too much. I ran out of my room and stood at the base of the grand staircase, looking up into the darkness. "What do you want?" I screamed, my voice cracking, my hands shaking. I had broken the final, most important rule, and the silence that followed was more deafening than any sound. For a few moments, I was just there, a terrified girl at the bottom of a staircase, alone with my trauma and whatever thing had stolen my voice and my memories. Then, from the top of the stairs, a door creaked open, slowly and deliberately. The door to the attic, where the Wilsons had told me to never go. A cold, musty air spilled out, smelling of forgotten things and dust. From the dark opening, something emerged. Not a shadow, not a voice, but a presence. A feeling of an immense, sorrowful weight, a profound loneliness so heavy it felt like it was physically crushing me. It wasn't menacing, not in a monster movie way. It was just there. And then I heard the last sound I would ever hear from that house. It was a whisper, not in my voice, but in a voice so ancient and tired that it felt like it was crumbling into dust as it spoke. A single, clear phrase. "You are here to help me. You are all here to help me. You will never leave." My blood ran cold. The phrase wasn't directed at me. It was directed at the children. At all of us. I wasn't just an au pair. I was the latest in a long line of people who were meant to stay there forever, a collection of souls to keep this thing company. The rules weren't meant to protect me. They were meant to keep a fragile piece until it was ready to claim me. I didn't wait to find out more. I turned and ran out of that house, and I didn't stop until my lungs were on fire. I didn't grab a bag. I didn't call for help. I just ran down that long gravel driveway, the sound of the house's silence and the ghost's whisper chasing me the entire way. I reached the main road and flagged down a passing truck, a kind old man who saw the terror on my face and didn't ask a single question, just drove me all the way to the next town. I never went back. I called the Wilsons from a bus station, and the woman who answered sounded confused. even a little irritated. She said the kids were fine, sleeping peacefully in their beds. When I tried to tell her what happened, she just laughed, a nervous, clipped sound. She said it was a silly old house, prone to creaks and groans, and that maybe I was just homesick. They sent my things to me a week later, packed in a single box. There was no note, just the box. And at the very bottom, beneath my clothes and a few books, was the crumpled, parchment-like list of rules. I still have it. I keep it in a locked drawer. I still don't know what it was that was in that house. I never will. All I know is that I broke the rules, and for a terrifying, fleeting moment, I came face to face with an ancient, lonely thing that had no intention of letting me go. And the only thing that saved me was my own desperate, human fear. My desperate, human desire to live. It's crazy to think about now, how it all started. It was the summer of 2019. I was 22, fresh out of college, and a bit aimless, to be honest. I'd just broken up with my long-term boyfriend. My parents were constantly on my case about getting a real job, and I felt like I was suffocating in my small hometown. I stumbled upon this au pair job posting online. The family was described as a wealthy, well-traveled couple with 2 young children. The pay was great, and they were looking for someone to live in their massive estate on the outskirts of town. It sounded like an adventure, a chance to escape, and a way to finally prove to everyone, and myself, that I could make it on my own. I remember the house from the pictures, a grand, Victorian-era mansion with a sprawling garden and an air of old-world charm that completely captivated me. I convinced myself it was a sign, a new beginning. The interview was short and a little strange. The parents, Mr. and Mrs. Albright, were impeccably dressed, but they seemed distracted. Mrs. Albright, with her sharp cheekbones and icy blue eyes, kept looking at her watch as if she had a flight to catch. Mr. Albright, a man with a stern face and a nervous twitch in his jaw, just nodded along as she spoke. They talked about their frequent business trips, their need for a reliable, flexible au pair who could handle being alone with the kids for long periods. They barely asked me any questions about my experience or my personality, just confirmed I was available to start immediately and handed me a contract. It felt rushed, impersonal, but the promise of a fresh start and a hefty paycheck was too tempting to resist. Little did I know that distant, hurried demeanor wasn't a one-time thing. It was their permanent state of being, a prelude to the isolation that would soon consume me in that house. They left the very next day. Just like that. Mr. Albright gave me a quick tour of the massive house, pointing out the kids' rooms and the kitchen, and then they were gone. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, a silence fell over the place that was almost oppressive. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was a heavy, expectant stillness, like the house was holding its breath. The kids, Liam, who was 6, and Lily, who was 4, were just different. They weren't like other kids. They were quiet, almost unnaturally so. They'd follow me around with wide, solemn eyes, and they didn't play with toys. They'd just sit and stare, and every time a floorboard creaked or a door sighed on its hinges, they'd flinch. It wasn't a nervous jump, more like a deeply ingrained, reflexive response. They were on edge, all the time, and their anxiety started to rub off on me. I found myself listening for sounds I couldn't explain, my own heart thumping in my ears in the dead of the night. The first few nights were the worst. I'd put the kids to bed, and the moment I was alone, the house would start to come alive. It began with the little things, a whisper of a draft, a settling creak in the floorboards. But then it got heavier. I'd be in my room, trying to read, when I'd hear what sounded like heavy, deliberate footsteps on the stairs leading up to the third-floor attic. They'd be slow, plodding steps, as if someone was carrying something impossibly heavy. And then, a door would creak open up there, slowly, agonizingly, followed by a faint, guttural sound, almost like a muffled cough. It was always followed by another sound, something like a dragging noise, a scraping across the floorboards. I tried to convince myself it was just the old house settling, but the sounds were too purposeful, too human. I started getting this terrible feeling in the pit of my stomach, like a knot tightening with every sound I couldn't explain. It was the same dread I saw in the kids' eyes, and it was quickly becoming my constant companion. That's when the kids started acting even weirder. One night, I was tucking Lily into bed, and she grabbed my hand, her tiny fingers clamping down with surprising force. Her eyes, usually so timid, were wide and searching in the dim light of her nightlight. "Will you still be here tomorrow?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. My heart seized. "Of course, sweetie," I said, trying to sound as reassuring as possible, but the words felt like a lie. A few days later, Liam asked me something even more chilling. We were playing with his toy cars. Or, rather, I was playing, and he was watching, when he looked up at me and said, with a quiet solemnity that was so unnerving for a 6-year-old, "Are you going to disappear like the other nannies?" I froze. My mind raced, trying to find a benign explanation, but the look in his eyes told me there was none. I tried to ask him about it, but he just went quiet, a familiar, distant look clouding his face, as if he'd said something he wasn't supposed to. The tension in the house was a physical thing by then. It was a pressure on my chest, a tightness in my throat. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sounds upstairs were now a regular occurrence, but they had changed. The dragging noises had stopped, replaced by what sounded like muffled arguing. It was low and guttural, like two people were having a heated, silent fight, and every now and then, I'd hear a name or a word that sounded like it was in a foreign language. It wasn't just a random noise, it had a cadence, a rhythm. I'd stand at the bottom of the stairs, my heart pounding, straining to hear, but the moment I got too close, the sounds would stop abruptly, and the silence would rush back in, deafening and sinister. It was a game, a cruel, psychological one, and I was losing my mind. I started locking my bedroom door at night and piling a chair against it. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but I knew, with every fiber of my being, that whatever was in that attic, I didn't want it to find me. The next day was a Saturday, and the kids were even more withdrawn than usual. They wouldn't eat, and they refused to go outside. Liam spent the whole morning with his face pressed against the living room window, just staring out at the trees. When I tried to get him to come play, he just shook his head and mumbled, "They're watching." I didn't know who they were, but the sheer terror in his eyes told me it was something real to him. As the day wore on, a new sound started echoing through the house, a low, rhythmic thudding from the attic. It was different from the footsteps or the arguing. This was a consistent, methodical thud, like something was being slammed against the floor or maybe the walls. It was slow at first, then it would pick up speed, a frantic, desperate rhythm that made the hair on my arms stand up. The kids didn't react to it, which was even more terrifying. It was as if they were so used to the horror that it no longer registered as a threat that I finally couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was up there. The thudding had been going on for hours, and the air felt thick with tension. I waited until the kids were asleep, and then, my heart hammering against my ribs, I crept out of my room. The house was pitch black and silent, the kind of silence that feels louder than noise. I crept up the main staircase, the one I always heard the footsteps on. The stairs groaned under my weight, each creak echoing in the oppressive quiet. I reached the landing and looked up at the attic door. It was an old, heavy wooden door, the kind you see in horror movies, with a brass handle that was tarnished and dull. The thudding had stopped, but I could still feel the echoes of it in the air, a vibration that hummed just beneath my skin. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling so badly I could barely grip it. I turned it, slowly, and the door creaked open, revealing nothing but a black void. It smelled of dust and something else, something metallic and rotten. My blood ran cold. My mind screamed at me to turn back, to run, but a morbid curiosity had taken hold, a need to finally understand what had been terrorizing me that I pushed the door open, just a crack at first, and my phone's flashlight cut a thin beam through the absolute darkness. The air was thick, heavy with the smell I'd noticed before, that mix of dust and something metallic, like old pennies, but with an underlying stench of decay that was sickly sweet and completely wrong. My breath hitched in my throat. I pushed the door wider, the rusty hinges groaning in protest, and swept the light across the space. The beam landed on a bizarre collection of items, old, moth-eaten furniture covered in white sheets, and a rocking horse in the corner that seemed to be swaying ever so slightly on its own. The arguing voices and the heavy footsteps had stopped entirely, but the thudding, the one that had been driving me crazy, was explained by the sight that my light finally settled on. In the middle of the room, there it was, a life-sized mannequin, crudely assembled from what looked like mismatched parts. Its arms were bent at unnatural angles, and its head, a featureless, lumpy thing, was tilted forward, as if it had been slammed against the wooden floorboards repeatedly. It was so still, so unnervingly human-like in its stillness, that my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. That I stood there, frozen, my flashlight shaking in my hand, unable to move or even scream. I just stared at the mannequin, trying to make sense of the horrifying tableau. That's when I heard it again. It wasn't the thudding from the floor anymore. It was a single, deliberate tap, coming from the wall to my left. It was low, rhythmic, and impossibly close. I snapped my head to the side, my light darting to the wall, but there was nothing there. Just an empty, peeling patch of wallpaper. But as I stood there, listening to the silence that followed, I felt a terrible draft on my neck. A cold, soft breath right against my ear. A whispered voice, thick and guttural, in that same language I'd heard from below. A single, chilling word that I couldn't understand, but whose meaning I knew instantly. Gone. I finally found my voice, a choked gasp that was part scream, part sobbing. I didn't bother to close the attic door. I just ran, stumbling blindly down the stairs, every single floorboard creaking and groaning as I ran. I had to get the kids. I had to get out. I burst into the kids' bedroom, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. I flicked on the light, my hands trembling so violently I could barely find the switch. "Get up. We have to go now," I yelled, my voice cracking with fear. I yanked Liam and Lily out of their beds, pulling them towards the door. But they didn't react with the fear I expected. There was no panic in their eyes, just a hollow, resigned kind of sadness. Liam, with that unsettling solemnity of his, planted his feet firmly on the floor. "You can't leave," he said, his voice flat and lifeless. "It gets angry when you try." I ignored him, my mind screaming at me to run. I dragged them towards the hallway, my entire body shaking, but their little bodies felt like dead weight. Lily just stared at me, her wide eyes watching me with a kind of pity, as if she knew what was about to happen. The moment we passed the door to the attic, the house came alive. The muffled voices I used to hear from the third floor were no longer muffled. They were a chorus of angry, guttural whispers, echoing from every room we passed, from the walls and the floor. A gust of cold air, smelling of rust and decay, rushed past us, and the heavy footsteps I knew so well started thudding above us, but faster now, more frantic. I felt a pressure on my back, as if something were pushing me, trying to trip me. I finally reached the front door, my hands fumbling with the deadbolt, the doorknob so cold it felt like it was burning my skin. I threw the door open and pulled the kids out into the cool night air, not stopping until we were far down the driveway. I finally dared to look back at the house, and in a flash of lightning, I saw it. A dark, hunched figure in the attic window, standing perfectly still, watching us leave. The parents had never traveled. They had never come back. The thing in the attic was all that was left of them, and it was waiting for its next au pair to disappear.